The night she chose. Moonlight lay like a silver blade across the mesa. It cut the scrub into hard, pale shapes and painted the canyon walls with long, cold shadows. The wind came down from the high country carrying the dry smell of greasewood and the faint, metallic tang of the river. In that wind came the sound of a breaking thing, the soft, terrified cry of a girl who had been given no path but one she would not walk. She had been called Naku, she who remembers, by the women who tended her wounds and braided her hair with thin, careful fingers. To others she wore different names: prisoner, payment, a thing exchanged. Tonight Naku used no names at all, only breath and the small, urgent language of the body. She moved like someone learning the contours of freedom for the first time, hesitant, every muscle an apology and a promise. For weeks the settlement had been a cluster of lean-to roofs, a trading post and the one-room schoolhouse, all pressed up against the edge of the prairie like a fist. Men came through on horses with patterns of dust and scent, merchants, drifters, soldiers with a neat line of a uniform, and the town accepted the tides they brought. That was how Naku had come to be known here, as an object in the flow, one of those things the men bartered in soft words behind doors. He first saw her where the post road turned and the scrub opened into a rough clearing, where the light from the trading post's lamp washed a pool on the dirt. He had been standing there arguing with a ledger, his thumb on a ledger's corner, when she stepped into the light. Up close, he recognized the bruise of an old injury across the angle of her jaw and the frayed edge of a blanket around her shoulders. Her hair was a long dark river gone thin at the ends. Her hands were small but marked with a map of work. He was Rowan Hale, not a hero's name, a common one like the man himself. He'd come west with a chest full of what he could call none of, a failed claim in the mountains, a brother lost to fever, a small, stubborn ranch that kept him on mornings he was tempted to follow some other life. He had the look of a man who had learned to keep his distance, the kind of man whose kindness came parceled and cautious. That night, though, when Naku's sob trembled in the light, something in him shifted. He could not name why. He only knew that the ledger fell open and he let it lie. "Don't make me belong to them," she said, a ragged pleading that made the little hairs on his forearms stand up. "Please. Let me belong to you instead." It was not the first plea he had heard. Quiet women begged for many things in those parts, but something about the way her hands clenched around nothing, the way the moon turned to silver in her eyes, held him. He could have walked away. He could have done what the town expected, exchange a glance, hand over a coin, let the men keep their bargains. Instead he stepped forward. "Who are they?" he asked, unnecessarily soft. She flinched like she'd been struck, then looked up at him with an unshielded honesty that was almost a fault. "The men who trade people. The ones who think I'm only a thing." The word broke off small, uselessly. "They will." Her mouth closed. The rest of the sentence did not need speaking. Rowan had seen that look before, the look of someone who had been numbered in a ledger and left off the page. There were practical reasons for his answer. He had a place with a roof that didn't leak, a small outbuilding where he kept tools, and a bed that creaked when the wind came down off the ridge. He had hands used to hard work, and a temper that could be put into fences and not faces. He had the quiet means to offer a different life. But there was also something more slipperier and older, an answering that came from watching a woman whose name he did not know be treated like currency. Perhaps it was the memory of his own brother, bartered by sickness to the ledger of doctors he could not afford. Perhaps it was simply that, in the face of the universe, some things refused to let a man look away. "Come with me," he said. It was not a vow, it was a proposal of small things, a bed, a bowl, food. He knew, recognizably, the language of survival. He did not promise lavender and sunsets. He promised work and shelter and, if she wanted it, the slow building of trust. Her mouth opened and closed on a laugh that was edged in fear. "Belong to you," she echoed, as if testing the newness of the phrase. "Belong to no one," he corrected softly. "But if you want a place, a choice, then come. Stay as long as you need." She came that night, carrying only a blanket and a small bundle with a few keepsakes, a carved bead, a piece of leather with a faded stitch, a scrap of cloth. Rowan watched her cross the yard under the wide indifferent stars and felt, for the first time in a long while, the outline of something like home adjusting itself to include someone else. They did not speak of the men who had owned her in the weeks that followed, at least not at first. Instead, they learned the smaller mechanics of shared space. He showed her which of his tools were for mending the fence and which were only for the stables. She taught him how to split kindling the way her mother had, with quick, efficient strokes that left his hands steady. She mended a shirt until it was better than new. She cooked with the grave care of someone who treated food as an act of prayer. At night she moved like a watch in his house, always alert, always listening. Yet the town remembered. Rumors, small as dust and as persistent, found their way into the post, into the schoolhouse, into the mouths of men washing the day's sweat from their faces. Men who had been in the sort of business Naku had escaped did not appreciate her staying under Rowan's roof. They whispered of debts, of unreturned favors, of the way a woman without a tribal guard could complicate their commerce. It was inevitable, then, that the peace would not hold. One dusk, men with the clipped look of traders and the blunt anger of people unused to being refused came to the edge of Rowan's property. They rode with the relaxed cruelty of those who assume possession. One of them, a broad man with a scar along his cheek, called out, voice rough as a thrown stone. "Rowan, hail," he shouted. "We come to collect what's ours." Rowan stood in his doorway, hands open and unthreatening, because that was his nature and because he wanted to see if words could still act as fences. Naku stood behind him, small and defiant, a spear of light in the doorway. "She's not for trade," Rowan said. The words were steady. His jaw worked the way it did when he wielded a hammer. He felt the old ledger in his pocket as useless as a child's toy. The man with the scar laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You think you can keep her? You think this is charity? Pay up, Hale, or we take what we were promised." His hand drifted to the butt of a pistol. Naku's laugh then, small and bitter, startled him. "You think you own a person?" she asked. The words were quiet but like a thrown knife. "You don't understand what your boy here signed up for," the scarred man said. "You think a roof makes a person free." Rowan felt the heat of his temper lift like a bellows and fold into something he knew how to do, make the ground unwelcoming. He moved sideways, blocking the doorway. "You'll go when I tell you," he said. There was no bravado in it. Only a simple setting of limits. One of the men shifted, and a pistol flashed. The world contracted to the flash and the thud of a boot. For a breath the scene balanced on a knife edge, villagers and traders pressed close enough to hear the flinty smell of fear. Rowan's hands were steady. Naku's hand found his wrist with a grip that seared him with its pressure, not weakness but iron. For the first time since she had come to his house, she spoke with a voice that carried. "If you take me," she said, so clear everyone could hear, "you will have my head, my name, my life. Not theirs. Not your coin. Take me if that is the price, but I will not be given like a saddle. Do what you must, but know the cost." The traders stared, thrown off by the thought that ownership could be resisted by a human thing that would not be counted. For a moment Rowan thought surely they would take her and split like vultures over meat. Then, mathematics of profit and risk pulling at them, they hesitated. The scarred man spat and gave a curse halfway between threat and calculation. "This a test," he said to Rowan. "You buy her, then. Show the coin." Rowan at that moment produced what he had, a roll of bills he'd been saving like a talisman, a flat purse of coin, a promise of a few more months of work. It was not much. It was not all. He pressed it toward the scarred man's outstretched hand. It was an ugly exchange, men and money and a girl's dignity like a line item, but the men accepted the coin because that was how they thought the world worked. Later, alone by the stove, Naku pressed the warmth of her palm to the metal and laughed, a short brittle noise that folded into nothing. "You bought me," she said. Her eyes were very bright in the low light. "No," Rowan said. "I offered you the choice. You came." She looked at him with something like wonder and, for the first time, something like trust. "Do you know what it's like," she asked, quietly, "to be measured like cotton? To be given and carried like a thing?" He hesitated, and then shook his head. He could not know. Yet he had known lack. He had known the feeling of being told what to do by forces he could not name. It was something they shared, two people stitched to different wounds. "Then stay," he said, simple as an instruction. "Not because I paid a man a sum of coin, but because you asked to belong. Belonging is not the same as ownership." She looked at him for a long moment, the moonlight falling into her face like a benediction, and then she tucked her chin and went to bed. He watched the shape of her in the quilts and felt the fierce, foolish certainty that had taken hold of him from the first night she crossed his yard, that the world could tilt and make room if people were stubborn enough. But peace, like plaster on a cracked wall, will show its cracks the next season. And the sort of men who believed people could be parceled would not be quiet forever. Chapter 2. Claiming the Table. Spring pushed through the prairie with stubborn green. Rowan's stubbornness and Naku's sharp hands made a surprising symbiosis. The barn was mended, the well dug a little deeper, and the fence to the north held its line. Children in the town began to call her simply Miss Naku, their syllables rounding affection into something neither barter nor pity. When they came by the house for a jar of jam or a bolt of cloth, she would step forward and braid their hair or knead the dough with a fierce, almost ceremonial care. In those small interactions, she earned something that no amount of coin could have bought, a place in the rhythm of a community. Yet in the corners of grins and in the hush of certain conversations, the trader's presence remained like a taste of iron. If the scarred man and his fellows were not content with one exchange, they would come back, like wolves learning a pattern. And patterns encouraged boldness. Late one afternoon, when heat lay heavy and the town was folding into siesta, the traders returned. This time they brought a different sort of threat, a letter from men higher up, the kind who wore the law like armor and thought the letter was ceremony. The traders expected a signature. They expected Rowan to yield. They expected Naku to be moved like chess. Rowan read the letter by the porchlight, a few formal words talking about debt and obligation and the right of the trader to reclaim property. It was dressed in legal tones, but its bones were the same as every other demand he'd seen, a calculation of profit versus risk. He looked at Naku across the table. She ate slowly, her hand steady as if the very act of eating anchored her to the present. "What do they want?" she asked. "They want the ledger to be balanced," Rowan answered. He had a reed of stubbornness in him that thrummed. "They want you back." She smiled then, slow and steady, like someone who'd learned how to keep the bones of an insult protected. "They don't know how to demand what a person refuses." "They'll try," he said. "They will use the law, or force, or both. They will make the town uncomfortable until someone decides it's easier to send you away quietly." Naku considered him. Her eyes were cool and precise. "Then we will make it not easier," she said simply. They did not make plans of war. This was not a story of rifles and sieges. It was a town that would be pushed to choose what kind of people they were. Rowan and Naku chose to be inconveniently honest. They would not hide. They would not be shameful in their daily tasks. They would sit at the table and break bread in plain sight. They invited neighbors, handicrafters and teachers and the little boy who ran the paper route into their home. They asked nothing from them but light conversation. They fed those who came. They refused to let Naku become an embarrassment or a secret. Small resistances have ripples. The traders found their easy leverage harder to grasp. The town's children were no longer content to be bystanders to cruelty. Women who had once lowered their eyes now carried bones in their voices. The tavern's loudest men, who had been used to talking about our arrangements, were met with sideways glances and snubs. Reputation, a fragile commodity in a small town, shifted. That is not to say the traders were defeated. They were not. They had resources, and patience, and the market's hunger. They tried a legal writ. They tried bribery. Once, a midnight fire burned some outbuilding near where Naku kept her few things. A small, coy punishment signaled to the kind of man who looked for weakness. Each time, the town bristled in its quiet way. Each time a neighbor brought a bucket and passed the bucket along. Each time, Rowan and Naku endured the pressure and did not break. At last the traders came with the bluntest instrument they had remaining, a public auction notice. They would set a day and put Naku's name to the post. On that day, they expected the townsfolk to watch with a bored detachment of people who prefer not to be involved. They misread the current. They did not know that belonging, once tasted, tends to spread. The morning of the auction, the post square filled with people carrying all the things of their daily lives. Some brought loaves of bread, others brought wrapped bundles of cloth. Mothers clasped infants and men returned from work muddy but steady. It was not a crowd that came to watch a curious spectacle. It was a neighborhood convening. Rumors of token coin were drowned in full hands of support. The traders' men took their place, smug as judges. They tightened their reins and smoothed their faces. Naku walked to the post as if she were walking into the center of the world. She wore a dress Rowan had mended, simple and clean. She carried no bundle, and in her eyes was a calm that unnerved more than the sharpest insult. Rowan walked beside her, not in front and not as a shield, but as an equal who chose to stand. The auctioneer spoke in the practiced cadence of someone who knew his words would hide the ugliness of their function. He spoke of debts and the need to settle accounts. He lifted Naku's features with the aimless cruelty of a man showing a prize. But the crowd's reaction was not the sound of detached curiosity. Children spat out the sour sweetness of anger. Old women moved forward, hands steady. One by one, people pushed objects toward the post, a bolt of cloth, a tin kettle, an old rifle that creaked like a tired animal. Rowan watched as neighbors, one by one, laid gifts on the ground between the traders and Naku. The logic was simple. If a person could be auctioned, then they could be bought back by a community that refused to treat each other as merchandise. The traders' men were unprepared for this kind of fury. They had been trained to manage wallets, not wills. They tried to force the bidding, but every attempt to claim Naku was met with a new offering, a new refusal to comply with the market's cruelty. People spoke up. Teachers, who read from a small primer about human dignity, A preacher, who spoke not in tantrums but in the steady language of moral shame, the young paperboy, who spoke in awkward bursts and said that a town where people were bought and sold was a town that would not prosper. Rowan felt the weight of the moment like a physical thing. He did not take the stage and shout. He did not decry the men with invective. Instead, he thought of the ledger lying in the trader's wagon, of the dull logic by which people had been numbered and exchanged. He thought of his brother's fever and the empty notch it had left in the world. He thought of the small, radical truth, that a table can be claimed not with knives, but by the steady, inconvenient act of sitting down and refusing to leave. When the time came for the traders to demand payment for the supposed loss, the town answered in deeds instead of coin. They offered labor. The blacksmith pledged to mend the trader's bolts for a season. The teacher offered lessons. The baker promised his bread. Everything had value. Nothing was a human being. The traders saw the calculus change and, for the first time in that day, hesitated. It was then that the scarred man made a clumsy, furious attempt to drag Naku away. A shout rose. Hands came from the crowd. Men who had once nodded to the trader's deals hauled the scarred man off. He swore and struck, but the village would not be cowed by fists any more. Women stepped between blows. The children wailed. The traders found themselves facing not a small, isolated house of two, but a whole settlement that had chosen to protect what it now recognized as home. Later, in the soft glow of evening, the traders left with their pride stripped thin and their pockets no fuller than when they had arrived. They took their writ and their legal paper and the echo of a day they would not forget. It would not be a clean victory. The traders would feel the bruise and come back in quieter, newer ways. But for the moment Naku stood in the yard and finally let out the cry she had held for so long. It was the sound of something unspent at last letting go. Rowan sat across from her under the porch light, and they ate the bread the town had brought. Neighbors drifted by like warm embers, sharing jokes and the small business of tending wounds and mending fences. Naku's hands were steady. She reached for his hand not as a demand but as an offering. They clasped. "We didn't belong to anyone today," Naku said, dry laughter at the corner of her mouth. "We belong to ourselves and to these," she nodded to the road, to the people who left small tokens like seeds. "And I like that." Rowan smiled, thinking that belonging had always been something you claimed at a table, by breaking bread, by letting the world see you, by refusing to let others imagine you as less than a person. It was a different kind of owning than the traders had practiced. It asked for consent, for reciprocity, for the risk of staying. When the moon lifted and the town fell quiet, Naku walked out to the fence and watched the stars with the steady absorption of one who thought of futures. Rowan joined her and they stood in the hush, the night like a held breath. "Would you ever think of leaving?" he asked, blunt as the stakes demanded. She considered the question like one choosing a path through a thicket. "There is a land I remember," she said, "with mountains like the ribs of the world. I might go back one day, to see my mother's house. But not if it is to belong to someone else." "Not that way." "Not that way," Rowan agreed. They stood there, two figures against a vast sky, and Rowan thought of the traders and their arrogance. He thought of how easy it had been for men so used to taking to convince themselves the world would bend to their will. He thought of how harder and truer it was to sit at a table and make space for another person's choice. He thought of how the town had shifted, the chemistry of small kindnesses building a bulwark stronger than wages and greed. In the months that followed, Naku's presence became the quiet drumbeat of the town's conscience. The traders, bruised, reeled into quieter practices, and fewer souls were moved like stock. Naku taught children to weave, she tended infants, she visited the old and mended their blankets with hands that remembered how to hold. Rowan learned how to ask for help and to allow himself the relief of being cared for. He learned how to make a table that was wide enough for two and other people to sit around. One evening, as the first frost touched the high grass, Naku sat at the table and carved a small bead from bone. She finished it with a practitioner's focus and then pushed it across to Rowan. "For the ledger," she said with a small, sharp grin. He took it and tucked it into his shirt pocket like a secret. "For the table," he answered. They were not heroes on banners. They were two people who had refused to perform the small commerce of dehumanization. They had, in their own way, claimed the whole table. Outside, the prairie stretched, flat and indifferent. Inside, bowls were washed and chairs scraped and a small light burned against the dark. And when the traders next rode through, hoping the town had returned to its old, comfortable rules, they found the porch empty not because the town had yielded but because it had learned how to feed its own. They turned their horses and left, counting coin that would not buy what it once had. Naku leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The world was not fixed. It never would be. But the small, stubborn rituals of belonging, choosing who to sit beside, who to feed, who to call family, had changed the accounting. In a place where people often reduced each other to lines on a page, they had chosen instead to make a table big enough for everyone who would come and choose to stay.